The bright lights of the television flickered across the dark living room, casting long shadows on the walls. She sat curled up on the worn-out couch, still wearing her work uniform, the exhaustion of a long day etched into her every feature. On the screen, there he was, standing tall and confident, dressed in an impeccable suit, holding a glittering award in his hand. Cameras flashed around him, and the crowd erupted into applause as he smiled, thanking everyone who had supported him. Everyone but her. His words rang out clearly, full of pride, and yet they felt like knives cutting through her. She clutched the thin blanket tighter around herself, feeling the crushing weight of memories flooding back. She remembered the nights spent working overtime just to keep the lights on, the meals skipped so he could eat, the endless words of encouragement she whispered into his ear when he had been on the brink of giving up. She had believed in him when no one else had. She had built him up when he had been nothing. And now, as he basked in glory, she was nothing more than a shadow of his past. How had it come to this? We met when neither of us had anything to our names but dreams and stubborn hope. It was one of those late summer evenings where the air was thick with possibility, and everything felt alive with potential. He had been sitting on the back steps of a local coffee shop, strumming a guitar with a cracked body, singing to no one in particular. I had been walking home from my shift at the diner, my feet aching, my pockets nearly empty, but my heart still strangely full. There was something about the way he sang that made me stop, something raw and aching in his voice that resonated with my own silent struggles. I offered a shy smile, and he grinned back, a flash of boyish charm that would later become so familiar. That night, we talked for hours under the stars, sharing stories, dreams, and fears as if we had known each other forever. Our lives quickly intertwined. We moved into a tiny, crumbling studio apartment where the walls were thin, and the heater barely worked. We made it a home with second-hand furniture, hand-me-down dishes, and a lot of imagination. Some nights, when the cold seeped through the cracks, we bundled together under a pile of mismatched blankets, laughing at our misfortunes and dreaming about the future. We shared everything: cheap instant noodles cooked over a single-burner stove, worn-out clothes from thrift stores, and whispered promises of better days ahead. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to keep us afloat. Mornings began before the sun rose, my hands red and raw from scrubbing floors, my body heavy with exhaustion. After the first shift ended, I would rush to the next, serving tables with a forced smile, pocketing tips that barely covered rent. He chased his dreams with relentless passion, pouring his heart into his music, his art, whatever vision had taken hold of him that week. I believed in him so fiercely that I did not think twice about sacrificing my own dreams. College classes I had once been excited for slipped away because we could not afford the tuition. Opportunities came and went, but I stayed focused on him, on us, on the future I was sure we would build together. We lived on hope and borrowed time. Every small success he had felt like a victory for both of us. When he landed his first gig at a rundown bar, I was there, cheering louder than anyone else. When he got his first tiny paycheck from a freelance project, we celebrated with a carton of ice cream and dollar store candles, pretending it was a grand feast. Our love was not about material things. It was built on shared dreams, unwavering support, and the belief that together, we could conquer anything. He was grateful then, or at least he seemed to be. He would hold my hands, calloused and rough from endless hours of work, and kiss each finger, whispering promises against my skin. "One day," he would say, his eyes burning with conviction, "you will not have to work like this anymore. One day, you will have everything you deserve, and more. I will make sure of it." And I believed him. How could I not? His words were laced with so much emotion, so much sincerity, that they wove themselves into the very fabric of my heart. There were hard nights too, darker than we ever admitted out loud. Nights when bills piled up faster than we could pay them, when the power was cut off and we sat in the dark, holding each other and pretending it was romantic. Nights when the hunger gnawed at our insides and I would tell him I was not hungry just so he could eat the last packet of noodles. Nights when his frustration boiled over into anger, and I bore the brunt of it, telling myself it was just the stress talking, that things would get better, that love was supposed to endure the hardest of times. I sold things I treasured to help him chase his dreams. My grandmother's locket, the one thing I had left of her, was pawned to fix his broken laptop. A collection of books that had been my sanctuary during lonely childhood days was traded for spare cash to buy supplies for his projects. Each sacrifice felt like an offering to the altar of our future, a future I was building with bleeding hands and unwavering faith. Friends and family started to question my choices. They saw the toll it was taking on me, the light dimming in my eyes, the exhaustion weighing down my every step. But I brushed off their concerns with a smile, with that same stubborn hope that had brought me to him in the first place. He just needs time, I would say. He just needs someone to believe in him. I believed in him with everything I had. I believed in the man he was, and even more in the man he could become. In those days, love was not a feeling. It was a decision, a commitment, a fierce loyalty that demanded everything and gave back very little. But I was willing to pay that price. For him, for us, for the life we had promised each other. Looking back now, I realize that love built on sacrifice alone is a fragile thing, vulnerable to the first winds of change. But back then, in that tiny apartment filled with secondhand dreams and endless nights, I truly believed that love could conquer all. I truly believed that as long as I stayed by his side, as long as I kept giving and believing, we would rise together. And for a while, it almost seemed like we would. His dream was not a simple one. It was not the kind of dream that could be achieved with a steady job and a safe life. No, he wanted more. He wanted to build something that would leave a mark on the world, something that would make people remember his name long after he was gone. He wanted to create a company that would change lives, inspire others, and make him a success story worth telling. His passion was magnetic, and I was drawn into it, pulled along by the sheer force of his ambition. Every late-night conversation, every whispered promise, revolved around this dream. It became our dream, or at least that was what I told myself. Supporting him meant making choices that chipped away at pieces of my own life. When my sister announced her engagement and asked me to be her maid of honor, I agreed with excitement. But when the date of her bridal shower conflicted with an important networking event for him, I did not hesitate. I made my apologies to my family and stood by his side, smiling and clapping for people whose names I could barely remember, believing that my presence there was an investment in our future. Family gatherings, childhood friends reunions, even simple Sunday dinners with my parents became rare events for me. I missed them all, always telling myself that there would be time later, that once he succeeded, we would have all the time in the world. Career opportunities came and went like passing ships. Once, a manager at the diner where I worked noticed my dedication and offered me a chance to train for a management position. It would have meant better hours, better pay, and a step toward a stable future. I was excited, filled with a hope that had almost withered away. But when I told him, he frowned, telling me that the long hours would take me away from helping him. He needed me to be there for him, to help with errands, to support his meetings, to be his rock. I told the manager I had to decline, my voice steady even as my heart cracked a little more. Despite everything, there was an intimacy between us that made it all feel worthwhile. In those moments when the world seemed to be against us, we clung to each other with a desperate kind of love. We were a team, or so I believed. There were nights when we sat on the floor of our apartment, maps of the city spread out before us, plotting where his company would have its first office. We scribbled ideas on napkins, made lists of potential clients, dreamed of hiring employees who would one day thank him for changing their lives. He would look at me with such fierce pride and say, "We are going to make it. You and me. I could not do this without you." And every time he said it, I believed him a little more. There were small wins along the way, little glimmers of hope that kept the fire burning. A local magazine featured a short piece about his startup, calling him an entrepreneur to watch. He signed his first client, a small business that needed his services, and when the first check arrived, he held it up like a trophy, his eyes shining with triumph. We celebrated with a cheap bottle of wine and pizza from the corner shop, laughing until our sides hurt, feeling like the richest people in the world. It was easy to believe then that all the sacrifices were worth it, that we were on the cusp of something extraordinary. He started getting invited to small business events, networking parties where he brushed shoulders with people who had already made it. I stood beside him, smiling politely, wearing second-hand dresses and shoes that pinched my toes, pretending not to notice the sidelong glances from women in designer clothes. He introduced me as his partner, his biggest supporter, and for a time, I wore that title with pride. I learned to read his moods, to anticipate his needs before he even spoke them. When he needed encouragement, I gave it freely. When he doubted himself, I built him back up. When he needed someone to handle the small, tedious details, I was there, working behind the scenes so he could shine. There was a sweetness to those early victories, a feeling that we were building something that was truly ours. Every small step forward felt like a giant leap. He would come home, flush with excitement, and sweep me into his arms, telling me how much he loved me, how none of it would be possible without me. Those were the moments that made the exhaustion, the missed opportunities, the growing loneliness, all seem like distant, insignificant things. But somewhere, deep inside, a small voice began to whisper questions I did not want to hear. Questions about the future, about my dreams, about whether I was losing myself in the process of building his success. I silenced that voice, convincing myself that it was selfish to think of such things. He needed me. We needed this. Love, I thought, was about putting someone else's dreams before your own. It was about sacrifice, about loyalty, about faith. So I kept sacrificing. I borrowed money from my meager savings to help him cover unexpected expenses. I lied to my parents when they asked if I needed anything, assuring them that we were fine, that I was fine. I ignored the gnawing feeling in my chest when I watched my friends move forward in their lives while I remained stuck, orbiting his dreams like a satellite around a distant star. There were moments when I caught glimpses of what might be slipping away. Sitting alone in our apartment while he attended meetings that stretched into the early morning hours. Watching the clock tick away as my birthday passed without so much as a text message. Seeing the distance grow in his eyes, the way his gaze seemed to look past me more and more often. But then he would come home, tired and triumphant, and I would forget the loneliness, forget the doubts. We would fall asleep tangled together, bodies and dreams intertwined, and for a few precious hours, it felt like nothing could touch us. We were still that young couple who had sat on the back steps of a coffee shop, dreaming of a future bigger than either of us. I told myself that love was about patience, about believing when no one else would. I told myself that if I just held on a little longer, if I just gave a little more, everything would be worth it. After all, we were a team. We had started this journey together, and surely, we would finish it together. I clung to that belief with everything I had, even as the sacrifices piled higher and higher, and the life I had once imagined for myself drifted further and further away. The change was not sudden. It crept in slowly, like a tide rising so gradually that you hardly notice the water around your ankles until it is too late. At first, it was just little things. A new suit he bought after signing a bigger client, a flashier car that appeared in our driveway after a particularly successful quarter. I told myself he deserved it. After all, had he not worked hard for this? Had we not both worked hard for this? Money started trickling in, then flowing more steadily. The apartment that had once been a humble sanctuary of shared dreams was soon replaced by a sleek, modern loft downtown. I marveled at the high ceilings and gleaming floors, feeling like a visitor in a life I had only imagined. He was proud, showing me around, pointing out features as though he had built it himself. I smiled and nodded, but somewhere deep inside, a small knot began to form. With the success came new people. There were colleagues, investors, mentors, and clients who saw potential in him and wanted a piece of it. Dinners that used to be simple affairs at home turned into reservations at exclusive restaurants. I would sit across from him, surrounded by laughter and clinking glasses, watching him come alive in ways I had never seen before. His laugh was louder, his smiles sharper. He spoke with an authority that seemed to leave little room for the girl who had once held his hand through the darkest nights. At first, I told myself it was the natural course of things. Growth demanded change. Success demanded confidence. I explained it away whenever I felt the sting of being left out of conversations, when he would excuse himself to take a call that lasted the entire dinner, leaving me to pick at my plate alone. I believed that my loyalty would be enough to bridge the growing gap between us. He became busier, and his schedules grew heavier. Meetings, conferences, weekend trips that had no space for me. I stayed home, making excuses for him to friends and family who wondered why he was never around. I painted him in the best light, convincing everyone, including myself, that it was all temporary, that once the foundation was solid, he would come back to me fully. But then there were the missed dates. My birthday came and went with nothing but a belated apology and a rushed dinner squeezed between meetings. Our anniversary was forgotten entirely. I had spent days preparing a special evening, decorating the apartment with fairy lights, cooking his favorite meal, wearing the dress he had once said made me look like a dream. I waited by the window, watching the city lights blur into one another, the hours slipping by until I finally realized he was not coming. When he finally called, his voice was tired, distracted, offering a half-hearted promise to make it up to me. I smiled through the phone, telling him it was all right, even as my heart broke into pieces I could not pick up. He stopped asking for my advice, stopped valuing my input. Once, he had come to me with every decision, trusting my instincts, leaning on my strength. Now, he made choices without consulting me, presenting them as fait accompli. When I gently questioned some of his moves, worried about the risks he was taking, he brushed me off with a tight smile and a dismissive, "You would not understand. It is complicated." I told myself not to take it personally. After all, he was under pressure. He had responsibilities now, people depending on him, investors to impress. I repeated these reasons like a mantra, trying to drown out the growing fear that I was no longer part of his dreams, that I was becoming an artifact of a life he was outgrowing. The arrogance was subtle at first, woven into his words and actions like threads of a new fabric he was wearing proudly. He spoke differently, moved differently, carrying himself with a confidence that bordered on superiority. He surrounded himself with people who fed that ego, who laughed at his jokes a little too loudly, who nodded along to every word he said as if he were a king dispensing wisdom. There were events I was not invited to, parties where he went alone, claiming they were strictly business. I believed him because it hurt too much not to. I believed him because the alternative was to accept that the man I had loved, the man I had sacrificed so much for, was slipping away from me. I clung to the memories of who he had been, of the promises we had made, refusing to see the reality unfolding in front of me. One evening, while cleaning up after one of his hastily organized business meetings at our loft, I found a gift bag tucked under the coffee table. Inside was a delicate bracelet, something far more expensive than anything he had ever given me. My heart leapt for a moment, thinking perhaps he had planned a surprise for me, an apology for all the missed moments. But when I looked closer, the tag attached did not have my name on it. It was addressed to someone I had never heard of. My hands trembled as I put it back, forcing myself to believe whatever story he would surely tell if I asked. But I did not ask. I was too afraid of the answer. The cracks were there, wide and growing, but I painted over them with hope and denial. I convinced myself that he was just stressed, that once things settled down, he would remember who we were, what we had built together. I reminded myself of the nights spent dreaming on the apartment floor, of the sacrifices we had both made, of the love that had once burned so brightly between us. And so I stayed. I stayed through the late nights and lonely dinners. I stayed through the dismissive glances and half-hearted apologies. I stayed because I still believed in us, even as he began to believe only in himself. I stayed because loyalty had become a chain around my heart, binding me to a version of him that no longer existed. I stayed because I loved him, even when he had started to forget how to love me back. Success did not just change his surroundings, it changed the very fabric of who he was. The man who had once found joy in the simplest pleasures, who had once laughed freely and loved openly, became someone I could hardly recognize. His days were filled with meetings, networking events, exclusive dinners, and trips to places I had only seen in magazines. His nights were no longer ours. They belonged to crowded rooms full of strangers who hung onto his every word, to parties that stretched into the early hours, and to a world where I did not seem to fit anymore. At first, I tried to adapt. I bought dresses I could barely afford, practiced small talk I never enjoyed, and smiled through evenings where I felt invisible next to the glittering people who now orbited around him. I tried to understand the new language of ambition and success that he spoke so fluently. I tried to find my place in a life that seemed to have no more space for me. But the subtle criticisms began. They slipped out casually, masked as jokes or advice, but each one cut a little deeper than the last. He would glance at my outfit before an event and suggest I wear something a little more sophisticated, even though it was the best I could manage. He would introduce me to his new colleagues and mention, almost as an afterthought, that I was not really involved in the business side of things. When I spoke about my own interests, the things that had once sparked hours of conversation between us, he listened with polite disinterest before steering the topic back to his world. It was not just my clothes or my ambitions that seemed to embarrass him. It was everything that had once made me who I was. My family, my background, the humble beginnings we used to be proud of, all of it became something he seemed eager to leave behind. He laughed off my suggestions that we visit our old neighborhood, saying he had no time for nostalgia. He rarely visited my family with me anymore, always too busy with meetings or last-minute travel plans. I would go alone, offering weak excuses on his behalf, trying to shield both them and myself from the painful truth that he no longer wanted to be part of that life. There was someone else too, someone who seemed to embody everything he now aspired to be. Her name was Vanessa, a sharp, ambitious woman who moved through his new world with effortless grace. She was a business partner, or so he said, someone who had helped him land a major deal that pushed his company into a new league. She was always there, at every event, every dinner, every important meeting. They shared inside jokes I did not understand, exchanged glances that spoke of shared ambitions and experiences from which I was excluded. I told myself not to be jealous. I told myself that I trusted him. But trust was harder to hold on to when I saw the way he lit up around her, when I noticed how his attention never drifted when she spoke, how he listened to her with a focus he no longer gave me. I started to feel like a shadow following him through his own life, a relic of a past he was trying to shed. The loneliness was like a constant weight pressing down on me. I would sit alone in the loft we had once dreamed of, staring at the city lights, wondering where he was, who he was with, and why it hurt so much to love someone who barely seemed to notice me anymore. I tried to fill the emptiness with busy work, taking on more hours at my job, volunteering, anything to keep my mind from dwelling on the growing void between us. Every now and then, there would be flashes of the man I had fallen in love with. A smile across a crowded room, a late-night phone call where he would sound like the boy who once promised me the world. Those moments were rare, but I clung to them desperately, convincing myself that the man I loved was still there, buried beneath the layers of success and ambition. I stayed loyal, even when it hurt. I stayed because I believed in the promises we had made to each other, because I believed that loyalty meant standing by someone even when the road grew rough. I stayed because I remembered the nights we had spent dreaming together, the sacrifices we had both made to reach this point. I stayed because the alternative, walking away from the life we had built, felt like betraying not just him, but myself. But with each passing day, it became harder to ignore the truth. The life we had once built together was no longer ours. It was his victories, his dreams, his new world. I was just a silent observer, clinging to memories that no longer held any weight in the present. I would watch him from across crowded rooms, laughing with people who barely knew the man he had once been, and wonder how love could survive in a place where it was no longer needed. Still, I stayed. I stayed because I was not ready to let go. I stayed because I still loved him, even as he drifted further and further away. I stayed because I hoped, in some quiet, desperate part of my heart, that he would turn around, look at me, and remember everything we had fought for. I stayed because hope, even when it is painful, is sometimes all that remains. The coldness settled in slowly, like a winter that no one quite notices until everything is already frozen. He stopped calling when he was running late. He stopped checking in when he traveled for days at a time. The small gestures that once spoke louder than any declaration, the quick kiss on the forehead, the way he used to reach for my hand even in sleep, disappeared without warning, without ceremony. In their place, there was a silence that grew heavier with every passing day, a space between us that no amount of loyalty could bridge. I told myself it was stress. Success came with pressure, after all. Maybe he just needed time, patience, understanding. I clung to those ideas because letting them go meant facing the unbearable possibility that he simply did not care anymore. The final blow came on a night that should have been a celebration. He had been honored with an industry award, a ceremony filled with flashing cameras, glimmering gowns, and endless champagne. I spent the afternoon getting ready, pouring all my hope into the way I styled my hair, the dress I chose, the shoes that pinched my feet just so I could look perfect beside him. I wanted to be the woman he had once believed could stand beside him at the top of the world. When we arrived, he walked ahead of me, barely glancing back to see if I was keeping up. As we made our way through the crowd, I stayed close, trying to catch his eye, to remind him I was there. And then, in one single moment, everything shattered. We bumped into a group of his new associates. Polished, confident, exactly the kind of people he surrounded himself with now. One of them, a woman with an effortless elegance I could never replicate, looked at me curiously and asked, "And who is this?" He barely paused before answering, his voice smooth and careless. "Oh, just an old friend. Just an old friend." 3 words, delivered without hesitation, without the faintest hint of the life we had shared, the battles we had fought, the love I had poured into him without measure. I stood there, frozen, my heart slamming against my ribs while the group smiled politely and turned back to their conversation, leaving me on the fringes, exactly where he seemed to want me. I do not remember much of the rest of the evening. I remember the noise, the laughter that sounded too sharp, the way my dress suddenly felt too tight, too bright, as if I were an intruder in a world that had never been meant for me. I remember standing alone near the back of the room, watching him bask in the glow of admiration, watching him laugh at jokes I could not hear, watching him move further and further away from the man I had once known. When the night finally ended, and we found ourselves alone in the car, the silence between us was suffocating. I stared out the window, gripping the folds of my dress to keep my hands from shaking. I told myself not to cry, not to give him the satisfaction of seeing how deeply he had wounded me. But when we pulled up to our building, I could not hold it in any longer. "Why would you introduce me like that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "An old friend? After everything?" He did not look at me. He just shrugged, his eyes on his phone. "It was not the time to get into personal stuff." "Personal stuff?" The words scraped against my throat. "I stood by you when you had nothing. I gave up everything to help you chase your dreams. And now you cannot even call me your girlfriend." He sighed, finally putting his phone down and turning to me. There was no anger in his eyes, no remorse, only a weary detachment, as if the conversation bored him before it even began. "Maybe that is the problem," he said, his voice low and tired. "Maybe we are clinging to something that does not fit anymore. We grew apart. It happens." I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to say he was joking, to reach for my hand like he used to when things got hard. But he did not move. He just watched me, detached, indifferent. "You held me back," he added, almost as an afterthought. "Not on purpose. But you are not part of this life. Not really. And I cannot keep pretending that you are." The air left my lungs in a rush. I felt like I was drowning, grasping for something solid to hold onto, but there was nothing left. Only the harsh finality of his words, the confirmation of every fear I had tried to silence. So that is it? I asked, my voice shaking. After everything, you are just going to walk away? He did not answer. He did not have to. The door clicked open on his side, and he stepped out, walking into the building without waiting for me. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty seat beside me, trying to understand how love could die so quietly, so ruthlessly, without even a backward glance. When I finally made it upstairs, the apartment felt foreign, like a hotel room where the memories had been scrubbed away. His things were already packed. I did not know when he had done it, how he had found the time between meetings and award ceremonies to dismantle our life so neatly, so efficiently. There was a note on the counter. No apology. No explanation. Just a simple line, "It is better this way." Better for him, maybe. But for me, it was the end of a world I had built with my own hands, a world I had believed would shelter us both. And as I stood there, alone in the ruins of everything we had promised each other, I realized that sometimes the greatest betrayals are not marked by screams or slammed doors. Sometimes they come quietly, with a few careless words and the sound of footsteps fading into the night. The days that followed blurred into one long stretch of gray. I moved through them like a ghost, mechanically going through the motions of living but feeling nothing. I stopped answering my phone. I stopped going to work. I stopped eating anything that did not come out of a box or a can. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford, and when it did come, it was filled with dreams that left me gasping awake, clutching at a heart that felt irreparably broken. The apartment, once filled with the quiet comfort of shared dreams, now felt hollow. His absence was not just an empty space beside me in bed or a missing toothbrush by the sink. It was a gaping wound in every corner, a silence that screamed louder than any argument ever could have. I would catch myself reaching for my phone to text him something funny or mundane before remembering there was no longer someone on the other end who cared. The self-blame was relentless. I replayed every conversation, every moment, wondering where I had gone wrong. Had I been too supportive, too patient, too willing to sacrifice? Had I made myself invisible in my efforts to lift him up? The questions gnawed at me, hollowing me out from the inside. I convinced myself that I was the problem, that if I had been smarter, prettier, more ambitious, he would have stayed. Loneliness wrapped itself around me like a second skin. It was not just the absence of him that hurt, it was the realization that so much of my life had revolved around him that without him, I did not know who I was anymore. I had given so much of myself to his dreams that I had forgotten to nurture my own. I was adrift, unmoored, a shell of the person I had once been. Days turned into weeks, and the world moved on without me. But in the depths of my isolation, unexpected lifelines began to appear. An old friend I had lost touch with reached out after seeing one of my silent, cryptic posts online. She showed up at my door with a bag of groceries and a look of fierce determination. She did not offer empty platitudes or demand explanations. She simply sat with me, her presence a quiet reminder that I was not as alone as I felt. My sister, who I had often put on hold during the years I had been chasing his dreams alongside him, began calling me every morning. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we just breathed on the line together. But her voice was an anchor, steady and unyielding. She reminded me, gently but firmly, that there had been a me long before there had ever been a we. Even strangers played their part. The woman at the coffee shop who remembered my usual order and offered a smile when I could barely muster one in return. The neighbor who left a bouquet of wildflowers on my doorstep with a note that simply said, "You are stronger than you think." Tiny acts of kindness that, one by one, began to stitch my broken pieces together. Healing did not come in a sudden rush. It crept in slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. It was in the first time I laughed, really laughed, at a stupid meme my friend sent. It was in the first night I slept through without waking up in tears. It was in the first meal I cooked for myself, something more than just heating up leftovers, something made with care and intention. It was in the day I decided to dust off my old portfolio, the one filled with sketches and ideas I had abandoned when life became all about supporting someone else's vision. Art had always been my first love, the way I made sense of the world. Picking up a pencil again felt both foreign and familiar, like finding a forgotten part of myself that had been waiting patiently to be remembered. I applied for a job at a small local gallery on a whim, not really expecting anything to come of it. When they called me in for an interview, my hands trembled so badly I almost canceled. But I forced myself to go, to sit in that chair and talk about my passion, my vision, my dreams. Not his. Mine. When I got the job, it felt like breathing fresh air after years of suffocation. It was not glamorous or high-paying, but it was mine. A step forward, however small. A declaration that I was not going to let my story end with heartbreak and abandonment. Little victories began to stack up. I repainted the apartment, covering the walls in colors that made me feel alive. I started going on walks, letting the sun warm my skin and the breeze tangle my hair. I reconnected with friends I had neglected, finding laughter and camaraderie in places I had forgotten existed. I learned to enjoy my own company, to sit in a cafe with a book and savor a coffee without needing anyone else's presence to validate my existence. And through it all, I reflected on who I had been, on who I had become, and on who I still wanted to be. I realized that I had spent so much time trying to be the perfect support system, the perfect partner, that I had lost sight of my own worth. I had been more than just the girl who stayed. I had been the girl who loved fiercely, who believed in someone else's dreams so completely that she made them her own. That was not weakness. That was strength. Misplaced, perhaps. Misused by someone who could not see it. But strength nonetheless. I was not broken. I was not disposable. I was not a footnote in someone else's success story. I was my own story. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to start writing it. 2 years later, my life looked nothing like it had during those dark, broken days. I had built something beautiful from the wreckage he left behind. I had taken a small corner of my dreams and grown it into something real. Working at the gallery had blossomed into curating my own exhibits, and eventually, opening a modest art space of my own. It was not grand or flashy, but it was filled with color and hope, and every inch of it reflected the woman I had fought to become. Travel had also become a part of my healing. I spent weekends exploring nearby towns, discovering art, food, and people who lived passionately and honestly. Each journey stitched a little more confidence into me, teaching me that the world was wide and full of possibilities that had nothing to do with the future I had once tried so desperately to build around him. I had carved out a life that was simple but deeply satisfying. I woke up excited for my days, my time no longer tethered to someone else's expectations. I hosted small art workshops for children and adults, helping others find their voice through creativity. I had a circle of friends who celebrated my victories, no matter how small, and who stood with me when the inevitable tough days came. It was on an ordinary afternoon, while setting up for a community event at the gallery, that our paths crossed again. I was adjusting a display when I heard a voice behind me, tentative and unsure. Turning around, I found him standing there, a shadow of the man I remembered. His once meticulously styled hair was now a little disheveled. The arrogance that used to radiate from him like heat had faded, replaced with something weary and uncertain. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The past hung between us, thick and heavy, but it no longer had the power to unmoor me. I simply stood there, grounded and calm, waiting for him to speak. He offered a weak smile and said my name like a question, as if unsure if he had the right to even utter it anymore. I nodded politely, feeling a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching the moment unfold from a distance. He tried to make small talk, stumbling over compliments about how great the gallery looked, how proud he was of me. There was a desperate edge to his voice, a quiet longing that made my heart ache, not for what we had lost, but for the man he had become. It was clear that whatever grand dreams he had chased had not filled the hollow spaces inside him. After a few awkward moments, he finally admitted what he had come to say. He missed me. He thought about me all the time. He wondered if there was any chance we could find our way back to each other. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt nothing. No anger. No longing. Just a quiet, bittersweet gratitude. Because standing there, in my own space, surrounded by my own success, I realized that I no longer needed anything from him. I had outgrown the version of myself that needed his love to feel complete. I smiled, a real smile, and gently shook my head. I thanked him for coming, wished him well, and excused myself to get back to my work. There was no drama, no tears. Just a clean, quiet ending to a chapter that had already closed long ago. As I returned to my display, my hands steady and sure, I felt a profound sense of peace. I had stayed true to myself, even when he had not. I had taken the loyalty and love I once gave so freely to him and redirected it back to myself. I had rebuilt not just a life, but a sense of self that no one could ever take away again. Life had taught me that loyalty was a beautiful thing, but it had to be rooted in something solid. It could not be blind, and it could not be one-sided. True loyalty began with being loyal to oneself, to dreams, to dignity, to worth. I had learned that self-worth was not negotiable. It did not fluctuate based on someone else's recognition or approval. It was something that had to be nurtured from within, tended like a precious flame that could light the way even through the darkest nights. And resilience. Resilience was the quiet power that carried me through. It was the decision to get up one more time than life knocked me down. It was the stubborn refusal to let someone else's inability to love me properly dictate the way I loved myself. As the evening sun poured through the gallery windows, casting everything in a warm, golden light, I paused to soak it in. I thought about all the versions of myself I had been, the girl who believed in his dreams, the woman who shattered when he left, and the survivor who pieced herself back together with trembling hands. And now, the creator of her own life. I was thriving, not because he had come back or because someone else had filled the void he left, but because I had chosen to fill it myself, with dreams, with love, with purpose. I had stayed by his side when he had nothing. I had believed in him when no one else did. And when he left me behind, thinking he had outgrown me, I found out that it was I who had outgrown the small, narrow life we had planned. I had not lost. I had not failed. I had simply been set free. And now, standing in the middle of a life that I had built with my own two hands, I knew this with every fiber of my being. I was enough. I had always been enough. And I would never again let anyone make me forget it.